Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Olmo with Key Performance Ideas, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Hyperion Planning Approvals. Today's webinar will be presented by Deanna Sunde. Deanna Sunde is an Oracle ACE Associate and Delivery Director for the West region. Deanna's experience encompasses over 16 years with Hyperion and 5 years with Oracle Financials and Industries focused in oil and gas, energy, insurance and financial services, health services, and entertainment. She holds an MBA in finance and a Bachelor's of Science in economics and is a former certified public accountant. Deanna is also a certified implementation specialist for Hyperion Planning and SBASE and is a leader in the Hyperion community. She is a frequent speaker at user group conferences and webcasts such as Oracle Open World, Kscope, Collaborate, OAUG Connection Point, and regional user groups throughout the U.S. Thank you, Deanna, for joining us today.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you all for taking time out from your busy schedules to attend this webinar. So the agenda is we're going to first introduce you to the approval process and then go through the configuration steps, including some screenshots on how to do the various steps to set up the approval process, and also how to enhance the approval process with other planning functionality. Also, we're going to discuss the completion of task lists and some custom data form options that you can use instead of the approval process if you so wish. So what is the approval process? The approval process provides a way to plan, submit, review, and approve plans, budgets, and forecasts. It allows for multiple levels of review and approval within your organization, but you can still have controls. FP&A department can provide oversight, and they can be the final approvers. It's a way to push planning to budget owners rather than just the FP&A function. You can design the planning approval process to be anything from simple to more complex. You can use it as a tool just to see who has completed their budgets, or you can build it more as an integrated, interactive tool that ensures the data quality and the timely submission of your budget. So some benefits of the approval process. It provides and supports simple to complex submission processes. It can be very flexible and tailored to your application. It can automatically assign the owner of a planning unit and the approval process and promotion process. You can also build data-driven process rules. From a business standpoint, it provides higher accountability, faster and simpler plan submission, and you can get better quality submissions by using the approval process. So if you're familiar with the old workflow, which was available up through version 11.113, the new approval process that started with 11.1.2, there's quite a few differences. So a lot of times people in versions that were older really couldn't use the workflow process because it did not meet their needs. For example, it used to be only the combination of scenario, version, and entity which defined a planning unit. But with the new approval process, you can also add an optional secondary dimension, such as a product or project. In the old workflow process, you had to explicitly select the approver, so that's considered a free-form template. With the new approval process, you can do bottoms-up, which assigns the owner from the person working on the planning unit up through the hierarchy, or distribute, which is assigning it to the top of the hierarchy and then work your way down through the promotion path. Or it also can be free-form, so there's a lot more flexibility. Planning units, hierarchies within the workflow used to be more of a fixed design, but there's a much more flexible design with the approval process. You can assign different templates to different planning units, for example. There's other functionality also available. So with workflow, you had planning unit annotations, an audit trail, and you could also lock the planning units after submission. With the approval process, additionally, you have data control options through data validation within forms, graphical view so that you can see the promotion path, and also dynamic promotion paths. So the promotion path can actually change and be more flexible even versus what you originally designed for your process. So there's some changes in terminology with the new approval process. So it used to be called workflow. Now it's called approvals, or that's also synonymous with process management or the approval process. So starting with version 11.121, we use the word or term approvals. Planning units, now you can add a secondary dimension. That's one of the biggest changes, which actually makes it much more functional than it used to be. And again, the approval templates, you have the free form where the user has to explicitly select who the next owner will be. But you also have the bottoms up, so the ownership is automatically transferred from that next owner to the next one bottoms up in the hierarchy that you established, or distribute, where the ownership is automatically transferred to the next owner from the top down. So planning units are, the definition of that is the combination of scenario, version, and entity, or part of an entity. Scenarios and versions are the basis of the review process and the cycle. Planning units can submit planning data for a scenario and version. For example, you can do like a best case version or for a particular entity and scenario. You can also include secondary dimensions within that entity as well, so you can actually get more granular when you're defining your planning unit. The secondary dimension, again, could be like a product or really any other dimension that you might wish. So the promotional path is predefined, so you can move from one unit to another until the process is complete. It follows that promotional path that you set up initially when you select the owner and the reviewer for a planning unit, unless some other event triggers a change in the promotional path. Also, what's important to note is that the owners and reviewers don't have to be individual users. They can be groups. So that results in more flexibility in your system, especially if people are out of the office or people are just busy. However, there can only be one user that is the owner at a time, even if it's a group that actually is the owner of that planning unit. There can also be data-driven approval, so that the validations in a form can dictate whether you stop the process and make the user fix the issue, or whether that gets redirected within the approval process to someone else who was not on the original promotional path. For example, you might want to do that if the users are entering their budgets and forecasts, maybe they're exceeding or not reaching some kind of expense or revenue boundaries. So in that case, you might want to stop the process and make them change their results until they meet that condition, or you can also say that it goes to another user who's part of the system but not necessarily on the promotional path. So an example of that could be maybe they're doing new hires and they have added more than, say, 5 new hires, and that means that HR needs to review the budget submission. And also, you can graphically see the organizational hierarchy that is being used in respect to the approval. So that's new with version 11.1.2. So here are the steps to configure the approval process. Step 1 is that you have to provision users and shared services in order to administer the approval process. So there's some different roles for approval administrators that are listed here. So you need to have, for example, an ownership assignment, someone who can actually assign the owners and reviewers. Then you would determine the appropriate template that you want to use for your process, either freeform, bottoms up, or distribute. Then you would create one or more planning unit hierarchies. One thing that is important to note here is that if you enable process management for your system, it doesn't mean that every single entity has to be part of the process. You can pick and choose which ones are going to be included in the approval process. So it's not all or nothing. There's also a middle ground. This next step would be to add validation rules to forms. This is optional. And then you would update task lists to include approval steps so that the users, know that they need to do the approval process, and it's part of that task list that leads them through the budget process. And then lastly, you would initiate the approval process and manage it. So here are some screenshots on how this works. So first we will configure an approval, and we'll do the following. We'll create a planning unit hierarchy, add a secondary dimension, assign owners and reviewers to those planning units, and then review the status. So to create a planning unit, on the top screen here, you can see that this is a bottoms-up example. So that's probably the most common. So there's not additional fields to fill out. But in the second example, it's a custom process, so there are some additional steps here. And it's not all entities that are being part of this process, although the template is actually bottoms-up as well. So then you can, if you wish, add a secondary dimension. In this case, it's the product dimension. And we've specified which products to include with that particular entity. And you'll notice on the left there are check marks that indicate whether that particular entity is part of the process. Also, you can auto-include. If you check that box there, what will happen is any additional members that are added to the hierarchy underneath the member that is part of the process, in this case, total product. So if you get a new product added under total product, it'll automatically be included in the process management here. So that's nice and dynamic. The next step is to assign owners and reviewers. So for the owner, again, that can be a user or a group. And for the reviewer, you can have multiple reviewers. In this case, there's just one shown, but you can have multiple reviewers, and then you would just do that by selecting all the reviewers that you want. And if you're doing a bottoms-up process, it would create the promotional path in the order that you set those reviewers on this screen. Here's the graphical representation. If you click on the button on the previous form tab on the promotion, you can see the actual graphical representations of what the process looks like, given the owners and reviewers that are part of it. The review status screen will show you what the approval status is for each of those entities and planning units. So you can see which ones are under review or if it's been approved and such. So there are other ways to enhance the approval process that is not strictly part of the approval process, but it's optional. So there's a list here of all of these different types of items. I think it's kind of nicer to look at it. On this screen here, you can see that there are 3 basic steps. First, you do your plan, where you're actually entering in your data for your budget or your forecast. Then you would promote your planning unit to the next person, and then they would review and approve it. So within the plan phase, we can do data validations on a form. We'll see a screen and talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Then you'll see you can actually enter cell comments just like you would within a plan, even if you're not using the approval process, and also supporting details where you can put in additional details. For example, like my travel expenses, I'm going to take 3 trips times $1,000 a trip, so my budget is $3,000 total. So it can do the math and give you those supporting details as you're building out your budget. The next step is to promote. So within the promotion process, if you're using the approval process, you can also do planning unit annotations that give a little bit more commentary on why your plan is the way it is, and then the reviewers can see those comments. So it's just another way to do comments. You can also do an audit trail and control checks as well. As people are reviewing and approving the process, you can update the promotional path so it is flexible, so it's not cut in stone based on how you originally defined it. You can also use the Microsoft Office out-of-office delegation. So if you're out of the office, you can have your planning units that you're supposed to be approving sent to someone else. And there's also reporting for administrators on the status of the various planning units, whether they're complete or not, who has them. So here's an example of a validation form. So this would be created by administrators in a data input form. And you can set the validation to set the promotional path to be different or to not allow the planning unit to be promoted to the next step. So based on the conditions, you can also do color coding as well and put in some comments as to what the issue is, so that the user entering the data knows what the problem is. So for Outlook, you can use the out-of-office assistant, which can handle incoming planning units. There are various actions that can be set, including promoting, rejecting, delegating, submitting, and selecting a new owner. You can also add annotations that says, why you're promoting it or delegating it to someone else, like I'm out of the office, and you could put the dates in. Email notifications can also be sent so that users are notified when some action is taken on their planning unit, so they know what state it's at. Administrators can update the promotional path, and at any time they can approve a planning unit. They can also promote it on behalf of someone else. They can also reject the planning unit and push it back to the owner to go through the promotional process again. They can also restart the planning unit. If the planning unit is restarted entirely, that will delete any annotations. They can also run reports that group the planning units by status to review the status of the plan or budget. Admins in this form, they can also filter and add different layers and nesting of filters in order to look at the data the way they want to. This is especially useful if there are a lot of different planning units. So now I'm going to do a little demo video on the approval process when you're using a mobile device. So not only is the approval process available in planning, planning on the cloud, PBCS, and ePBCS, you can also update the approval process and use it from mobile devices.
In this overview, we'll show you the highlights of logging on and approving your planning units from your mobile phone. Download the Oracle EPM mobile app from the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. Log on using your Planning and Budgeting Cloud username and password. If this is your first time logging in, you will need to tap Configure Connection. Enter your username, password, URL, and domain name. Make sure to tap Done when you have completed an action and Save when you are finished. We will log in as Dawn Varel. Let's promote a planning unit. Planning units that require action are displayed on the Actions page. You can filter planning units by scenario, version, status, and substatus. Promote the planning unit by tapping the planning unit. We can see the history and promotional path. Tap the Action button and tap Promote. Enter any comments and tap Submit. The planning unit is no longer on the Actions page. We will log in as Maria Scott. We can see the history and that Maria can promote, sign off, reject, or freeze the planning unit. Maria approves Dawn's changes and promotes it to Jay Manning. Let's sign out as Maria and log on as Jay so he can approve the planning unit. Once it's approved, we can see the status has changed. In this overview, you saw how to use your mobile phone to log on and approve planning units. To learn more, visit the link shown here.
So next I'm going to talk about task list completion. This can be done either with or without using the approval process. So it's kind of a more quick and dirty way to track completion status versus implementing the approval process. So task list completion requires the use of task lists. It does not require using the approval process. Admins may also enter instructions for a task and create tasks that only contain text. Admins may enter a due date for a task, and they also can send email messages out for uncompleted tasks based on that due date. They can also make a task that's dependent on completing some other task. So maybe before proceeding to the next form, you have to finish the current form and mark that as complete. Task lists in general can also include forms, URLs. A good use of a URL is like maybe you have an internal finance website that contains lists of your instructions and policies and due dates. You can refer people in a task list to that URL. It also can include running business rules and running financial reporting reports. So users can navigate through the task list by selecting Next or Next Incomplete. Users can view the status of their tasks and due dates. Notice here, though, that this is an important thing to understand, that tracking is by form by user. So, for example, if a user has responsibility for maybe 10 different entities, you're not tracking the individual entities, but that particular user is saying that they're complete. Also, there's no out-of-the-box reporting for the status of task lists, but that's being improved on. So here's the administrator form to actually set up a task. You set up the task and then select the type, and you can enter instructions and due dates. Also, you can set up alerts, and you can make it dependent that this task cannot be completed unless some other task is completed first. So here's a user data input form. So they're inputting some data here. In the lower left-hand right, this is where they would mark whether it's complete or not, and then they can click the next or the next incomplete to go to the next item in the task list. Here's a sum status that shows what the percentage completion is and how many items are incomplete, so that it provides some information to the user on how they're doing. Another way of doing some kind of an approval process or completion process without using the out-of-the-box approval process or task list is by developing some custom data forms. So custom data forms are relatively easy to set up and maintain. It works with any version of planning. You can customize it to meet your requirements and process. The examples that I have here will show completion by owner, but you can also set different approval levels as well. The data form can be included within a task list if you wish. Accounts can be created to show the percentage completion in total or at various levels within the hierarchy. You can also use financial reporting or web analysis to develop reports to show the completion status and approval information, and you can also build exception reports that just show what is not complete. Also, you have to be able to trust your users because if you use this method, because even if they mark it complete, technically they can go back and make changes to their different entities and such until that scenario and version is closed. You could, in place of this, develop some kind of more customized security process where you maybe toggle users on and off from various dimensional member elements to stop them from doing actually entry after they are supposed to be done with a certain entity or part of the budget, but that would be something that would be, more customized. So for this example, it's an insurance company that has EPM, Hyperion Planning version 11.112. Their cycles are having a reforecast and a budget, and they complete next year's budget at the same time as they do the reforecast, which is essentially just a forecast. So they have a process to complete this year's forecast, and also there's a button in the form that will populate or precede the budget based on data from the forecast in the prior year. So they have various dimensions, including entity, which is used for two purposes, departments, for cost centers and also for individual insurance brokers. So the custom completion process that was built used the scenario and version dimensions along with the entity dimension. There are 5 data forms created in total. One for workforce. Workforce completion was done just for the budget. And then the expense and revenue completion forms were for both the budget and the reforecast. There were also a few accounts created using smart lists, which allow the users to actually pick the value from a drop-down, so they can actually select whether that particular entity is complete or incomplete. So there's an account for workforce, for expense, and for revenue. Also, besides being able to select complete or incomplete, it also could be inactive, so that selection is also allowed. That's kind of an important thing to note because you'll have maybe some historical data in your database and some old entities that are inactive. And if you're doing calculations as to at parent levels whether things are complete or incomplete, that's kind of an important thing to build in as well. And as I was speaking about earlier, you can also click and select from that drop-down whether to seed the revenue budget, either yes or no. So that's something that you'd want to do only once, because as you did the seeding process first and then you started working with that budget, you wouldn't want to seed it again and override those changes. That's more of a training issue for the users. So for business rules, there were various business rules as part of this analysis and seeding process. And some reports also were built to show the completion status, the budget seeding status, and whether the reforecast was incomplete and the budget incomplete. So those last 2 were exception reports. So here's just an example of their overall task list. And here's a completion form where you can actually see that at the top of the page here, they would select their actual entity, and then they would show from the drop-down, they would pick, whether the revenue was completed or incompleted, and whether or not they wanted to seed their budget from this forecast. Here's just a summary revenue form for them. And in my second example, this is an oil and gas company that was using version 11.1.2. They had budget and outlook cycles, which were essentially forecasts, and they did forecasting on a monthly basis. They also had an actual cycle where they were allowed to do some adjustments and capture some text comments. So for them, the custom completion process was similar. They defined it using the scenario version and the entity. One different thing here was that it didn't use their hierarchy for the entity dimension. Instead, they wanted to do the completion process at a higher level of parents. So we created some additional, basically dummy members for the process of the completion process to basically represent those divisions that they were doing the completion process at, instead of the individual entities. So there were 3 data forms in this example, 1 version for budget, 1 for the outlooks, and 1 for the actuals. Again, we had some smart lists to show whether the budget or actuals were complete or incomplete, and a business rule to set the completion status for the parent level members within their hierarchy. So users were allowed to see the completion status for all areas of the company, and the security actually would define which entities that they could update. So they wouldn't when you had multiple people in the form, they would not stomp on each other's data because they would only have access to one division. One advantage of putting all of the different divisions in the rows is a little bit of peer pressure. So if they see other people are done with their budget or forecast, they kind of know I better get on it because people are going to start to bother me if it's not complete. So peer pressure is never a bad thing. So the user in this example would select whether it's complete, incomplete, or inactive from the drop-down and then save the form. And the business rule at that point would run to set the appropriate status for various parent level members, also to show whether they at that upper level were complete or incomplete. Here's a business rule that would run when that would happen. So you can kind of see here it's doing a count on how many divisions there are underneath that parent, and if they're all complete, it's setting that parent level to equal to 1, which in this case, 1 in the SMART list represents complete. So that's my presentation. I'll turn it over to Greg to wrap up. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Deanna. And thank you all for joining us today for the webinar, Hyperion Planning Approvals. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. Deanna's and my contact information are on the screen. Again, thank you for joining us today, and have a great day.